I'll give you the first rule of entrepreneurship that I have learned. Use what you have. And a lot more people have pain. A lot more people have anger. A lot more people have shame. And if you can use that as your gas in the beginning, you'll eventually get to a point where you can get out of that loop and then find something that you are really passionate about. But if you can't tie your shoes, you can't lift the weight, you can't send the DM, then you have to start with whatever you have. And so for me, it was hatred of my current existence. I feel passionately about my viewpoint of the world, mostly because I struggled and I was in so much pain for such a long period of time. To get to the person who's like, how do I find my thing? I'm a big fan of being directionally correct rather than absolutely correct. Most people are trying to find the perfect answer when they have no perspective from which to make a judgment. They're trying to find the perfect thing to do when they haven't done anything. So how would you have perspective to make a judgment? I would read all the self-help books. I read, like every night, that's all I did. I just read all these self-help books, and I found one of them that said, there are people who are wantrepreneurs and entrepreneurs. And I remember hearing that word wantrepreneur, and I was like, it made me feel sad. I was like, I don't want to be fucking wantrepreneur. I was like, I'm not some bitch. Like, but I was like, but what if they're right? I am a wantrepreneur. I'm not an entrepreneur. I want to be one, and I'm not. And from that point, it took me 6 months to quit my job to actually decide to do the entrepreneurial thing. Slaves worked all the hours they were awake for their entire lives. In American history, in Egyptian history, in the rest of the world that had slaves, which is most of the world at some given point. I think like if they can do it, so can I. Now you're like, well, did they have a happy existence? Well, they didn't get to pick the work they did, but it means that you can work. That's if you have the cat behind you. You can work every hour of the day. I'm like, well, if you get to have the cheese and you get to eat the cheese the whole way you're going, then, I mean, there's the famous quote, you know, the person who loves walking walks further than the person who loves the destination. If you suffered from racial inequality, if you suffered from gender inequality, you would be completely justified in the fact that you are not achieving the things that other people who didn't have those disadvantages have achieved. And I say this as a white guy who was born in America to a doctor father. But to the same degree, you have the opportunity that Chris nor I have, which is that you can be an inspiration to people who went through the same thing. So many people want to project their idea of what they think your life should be like onto you. And it's just completely irrelevant. It just doesn't matter. You are going to die and you're not going to matter, and I'm going to die and I'm not going to matter. So why do I care about what you're going to say when you're not even going to show up to my funeral? Who gives a shit? And the thing is the rat, it's so simple. It's like there's cheese here. But what you really just need to know is that there's cheese out there. And there's a cat behind me for sure. And so if I just go anywhere away from the cat, I will have a higher likelihood of getting closer to the cheese. Not that I will find it, but I will get closer to it. And if you're like, well, I don't like doing anything. Well, it's like, well, then that's impossible. Because your brain is wired to be rewarded for things. And so you are doing things that reward you. That's why you do them. Like everything we do is because we've been rewarded for doing things like that in the past. And we project the same activities and we predict that doing things like we did in the past that reward us will reward us again in the future. And so it's like, okay, well, what has rewarded you in the past? Where's the cat? Go the opposite way. If you can't define the inputs and outputs that are going to get you what you want, then there's no way to start. Right? Because you don't know what you're supposed to do. You have to define what the input is that's going to get you the output you want. Now, once you know what that input output is, the next one is why aren't you doing it? And this is the Tony Robbins quote, but it's just when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change. And I think pain moves people far more effectively than pleasure does. Like death is the great motivator and the gun just reminds you. Point a gun at someone's head and you have absolute compliance and they will do what they need to do, right? Automatically, just like that. I think that if you can create the figurative gun to your head of the pain that you're experiencing, and then I'm a big fan of future casting out negative scenarios. So people talk about like positive visualization. I prefer negative visualization, which is what if I keep doing what I'm currently doing for the next 10 years? What will my life look like then? That usually takes my current pain and then just magnifies it. And then that allows me to get my action threshold high enough that it goes over the edge so that I can take that first move. In the Matrix, Morpheus takes him through a training program to teach him one thing about agents. And so they're walking down the street and there's all these people going, and he says, were you listening to me?
Or were you looking at the woman in the red dress?
And he says, look again.
Look again.
And the woman in the red dress who walked by is an agent pointing a gun in his head. And I see distractions the same way, which is that the better you become, the more attractive the woman in the red dress is. I believe discernment is the single greatest character trait you can have, because if you make the right decisions, the whole world is your oyster, right? If you can make the right call, the whole world is your oyster. And so for me, wisdom is the number one character trait that I wish to develop. I use the same formula that most people and most of us, myself included, use to destroy ourselves with these insecurities, with these negative character traits that we believe we have. And instead of saying an affirmation, you tell yourself the story of why what you're saying is true. You learn to argue against your own thoughts. And that's how you start developing this muscle, these traits that start to become a whisper and then a shout. And then they emanate from you and you project them when you walk in the room subconsciously. But it's a practice that goes from active to passive in your mind. One of my favorite sayings, probably like if I had one thing on my tombstone, it would be a permutation of a quote by Orson Scott Card, which is, we question all of our beliefs except for those that we truly believe and those we never think to question. All our brains do is just create and destroy meaning. And so we say, this is a threat, this is not a threat. We make we need to reinforce this behavior, we don't need to reinforce this behavior, all through meaning. And so if you can control what you deem meaningful, you can massively shift the odds in your favor. I think the moment you get to ego is the moment you stop growing, because you feel like you beat the level, but you just keep repeating the level rather than moving up, because there is a harder boss. And they just haven't faced it yet. The bigger the monster, the greater the hero. The things that we go through work on us more than we work on them. Like, you need to fight harder opponents. There's stimulus response, right? And so like we get to control the response, we control the stimulus. Was it it's either Seneca or Epictetus who's like, no one yells at a rock, right? And so it's like, if you are the rock, then like just doesn't matter, right? Like you just like eventually like people just fuck off and just leave you alone. I hated being an entrepreneur. I hated being a wannabe. I hated being one of those people who like talked about all the things they were going to do and didn't do anything. You only can be inadequate if you go to another level. If you feel amazing, it's because you haven't moved up.